The Spanish people did once they got the slaves to their sugarcane plantations, because that's where they were working them. They divided them up into sections, which they called cabildos, and those sections were sectioned out depending on where the slaves came from. Remember also that in Cuba, they had slaves from Nigeria, from Cameroon, from Benin, and they formed a different genre of music, which kind of shares the same name, but it's not exactly the same. It's not exactly the same music. The Cuban rumba is West African. Son music is Congolese.
How did enslaved Africans in Cuba preserve their musical identity? I mean, of course, we know the very unfortunate incident of Africans being picked up as slaves and being taken to the Americas. There's some who landed in Cuba. So how are they able to keep their musical tradition to the point that it remained very close, unlike other spaces that had African slaves like the US? Jojo Twende Kazi.
So there was a lot of slaves taken from Congo by the Spanish to Cuba, which was a Cuban colony back then. Now, what the Spanish people did once they got the slaves to their sugarcane plantations, because that's where they were working them, they divided them up into sections, which they called cabildos. And those sections were sectioned out depending on where the slaves came from. So the slaves from Congo were in one region, right? So now what happens is, because they did not travel there with their music instruments or anything, they did not have, their main instrument was the kalimba, which was a thumb piano. They couldn't take those along, as you know. So what they did was recreate versions of their music while in the slave plantations. So one of the things that happened there is they came up with percussion instruments that were readily available. One of them was the claves, just two sticks that they look like bamboo sticks that you strike to create a sound. They also came up with drums called the bongos, two little drums that they put between the legs, and you know, that's how they played them. And then they adapted the Spanish guitar. It came in as a 10-string instrument called the bandola, but they reduced the strings to 6 because of how difficult it was to obtain the strings. So now what they did is combine the string instrument with the percussion instruments and vocal improvisation to come up with a genre of music called Cuban son, or son cubano. Now what they wanted their intention was to recreate the sound of this kalimba, which was their main instrument back in the motherland. So the Cuban song music from the plantations ended up in the cities of Havana and Matanzas back in the 1930s, now after the slaves were freed. So once they got there, they created entertainment centers of their own that they called solaras. And they used to play this music in the evenings. Now, if from history, those of you who followed the Cuban-American conflict, back in the 50s and early 60s, there was free movement between Cuba and the US. So a lot of the musicians ended up in New York, Spanish Harlem. And that Cuban song music ended up merging with jazz music and formed some kind of a ballroom genre called salsa. And a lot of us know what salsa is.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the Cuban sound mixed with Spanish sound by the Congolese slaves that reached in America.
Now let me pause you
One
there.
section there.
Yeah, let me pause you there, Jojo, because there's so much to unpack from what you just said.
Yes.
Especially on the musical side. There's
Right.
something interesting you mentioned that in Cuba, the slaves were organized based on the region they came from in Africa. And we know
Right.
that in the US, for those who are familiar with US slave history, it was quite the opposite. They made sure that people who spoke the same language were separated, were not in the same area, to completely erase their identity. So we see there was an opposite system in Cuba where they decided to put them together, which kind of partly explains, and Jojo, you can correct me if I'm wrong, why there was a retention of African identity within the Cuban slaves and, of course, with their descendants, as compared to the American counterparts, who, because of that separation, it seems like all those musical skills or any other cultural associated skills they may have had was completely erased after that first generation faded off. Is that correct, Jojo?
That's very true. Remember also that in Cuba, they had slaves from Nigeria, from Cameroon, from Benin. And they formed a different genre of music, which kind of shares the same name, but it's not exactly the same. It's not exactly the same music. The Cuban rumba is West African. Some music is Congolese.
Okay.
So because the enslavers divided them into these cabildos, these silos, they ended up developing their own music, although there was some connections.
Okay. All right. Now, how, like, so this music was in Cuba. Now,
Right.
within descendants, within slaves and descendants of slaves, how did it make its way back to Africa? Because that's a part that I think is very profound and that most people are not familiar with. Jojo.
Okay. Once the music got to New York, the American companies, including EMI and Victor, started recording this song music. And it became so popular around the world that they started exporting these vinyls. And some of those vinyls called GV series. Some of you may remember those as Her Majesty's Voice. Ended up in Africa. Some of them were exported to Africa.
You mean?
Right? Two, during World War II, there's also a lot of Africans that were recruited as soldiers to fight for the Western Alliance. So when these soldiers returned home, they went back with these GV series and gramophones. That's how the music returned, one of the ways the music returned home. Three, through radio. In places like Congo, the Belgians established radio stations mostly for political reasons. But later, these stations started playing music. And the music that was coming through was Western music, jazz, and the rest, and also this Cuban sound. So when Africans had this Cuban sound, especially in Congo, it sounded so familiar. So they embraced it more than they embraced the other genres. Do you want me to stop there?
Okay. No. I mean, there's a lot. There's quite a bit here you're unpacking, Omosh.